Hello my dears, welcome back to another video. Today is going to be another reaction because I'm still working on a deep dive, and so today I wanted to talk about the story of what's happened with Sydney Watson. So Sydney Watson is a content creator here on YouTube, and she's kind of gone viral recently because recently she tweeted about her experience with American Airlines where she was basically squished in between two obese people on the flight, and I'll let Sydney explain in her own words what happened.
So like I said, I was on a flight the other day which was just over 3.5 hours long from New York to Dallas, and I was sat between two extremely obese people, and I tried to take photos of it because I knew that the people on twitter.com would say that I was lying because that's their natural response to everything. But it was ridiculous. The whole thing was absolutely ridiculous, and I'm not exaggerating when I say that I was sardined. I was sandwiched between these two people to the point where I had little T-Rex arms. It's not fun as a general rule when people have to touch you without your consent. It's not fun when people have to invade your personal space. So at this stage, I'm extremely upset. My body is being touched in one way or another. I couldn't get away from strangers touching me because even when I leaned forward, which I eventually did on the flight for a little while, which just by the way, and not to be whiny about this, but on a serious note, that caused me back pain and hip pain. Because woo for having hip surgery. But if I wasn't leaning forward to get my arms away from being squished, my hips were still being pressed together because on either side, both of their bodies and both of their hips, or whatever part of their body was doing this, was pushing mine together. So I'm not exaggerating when I say that I had a third of a seat, a half of a seat. It was just... And at this point as well, I'm feeling bad for the guy sitting in front of me because I'm almost having to rest my head on his seat, which I don't know if he could feel that, but I'm having to do that to, you know, continue to drink tea and try to, you know, rage tweet. And he had his seat back, so every time he would adjust himself or shift in his chair, he's smacking me in the face with his chair. And so at this point, I'm squished, I'm a sardine, and now I'm getting a headache.
So unsurprisingly, this garnered a lot of attention and it got her a lot of backlash. If you haven't caught on yet, there are certain people in our society that you are allowed to offend, and then there are certain people in our society that you're not allowed to offend because we believe in equality, apparently. So naturally, she got into a lot of backlash for this. People were calling her the C word, people were calling her fatphobic. She even had an article written about her in one of the UK tabloids. I think it was the Daily Mail or something like that, if I'm not wrong. And it's just been really interesting to watch people's responses to it because people seem to be against her as opposed to against the situation that happened to her. And in my opinion, if I pay for a seat, I should be allowed to have the full width of my seat because that's what I paid for. You should be able to comfortably sit in your seat without having to have people invading your personal space. Like, I could not handle sitting in between people and feeling sandwiched in between them.
I'm claustrophobic, Darren!
Listen.
They don't get it! I'm claustrophobic!
So Sydney did tweet out to American Airlines about this, and their response was very dismissive. They just basically said, well, you know, all of our passengers come in different shapes and sizes. And it's like, okay, but even your own policy states that if you are an overweight passenger that you're supposed to buy two seats. Michelle McDaniel spoke about this in her video when she spoke about the situation.
And what's interesting enough is that this specific airline, they actually have a rule. Let's read. The current policy regarding overweight/obese passengers states that any traveler who requires an additional seat will be given an additional seat whenever one is available. Airline attendants will search the plane to see if there are additional seats available, and if there is, they will move passengers around to provide the airline passenger of size with 2 empty seats. This is cited as not only an airline policy, but as a safety precaution. Sydney, your life was in danger, and they just said, sorry.
Sorry.
When an airline cannot find an additional seat for a passenger, that passenger may be required to purchase a second seat and wait for a new flight. American Airlines, that's exactly what should have happened before the plane took off into the air and little Sydney was freaking getting squished by two very large people who clearly couldn't fit into their seat and needed to buy 4 total seats.
I do think that the dialogue that we have about obesity is very, very unproductive. And I understand why it's unproductive because the fat acceptance movement has made obesity centered around vanity. So things like beauty and aesthetics and everything like that. Because oftentimes when you hear people speaking about obesity, it's always from the lens of you can still be fat and beautiful. And so this has made it really hard to speak about obesity, because you can't speak about obesity without hurting someone's self-esteem or hurting someone's self-image. Now, whenever you talk about obesity in a negative way, people internalize that and they take it as you attacking them personally as a person, as opposed to having a criticism of the fact that being obese is not healthy. So objectively, obesity is not healthy, which is why when you get to a certain size, it's called morbid obesity, because the likelihood is it will kill you. I mean, think about it from your own personal experience. You see loads of really old people, so people who are, say, 80s, 90s, whatever, and you also see loads of fat people. But how often do you see really old fat people? And that's because, unfortunately, people who are really obese don't live as long. And no, it's not because death is fatphobic. I do find it really interesting because it's so strange. The way we look at obesity is so strange, because if someone was to develop cancer, you can objectively talk about the cancer, because the person who has cancer doesn't internalize it and look at themselves as the cancer. Do you know what I mean? Whereas like with obesity, people do internalize it rather than simply being like, I'm a person who is obese. They view it as I'm an obese person. Like the obesity becomes a part of their identity, which is, I think, where the cause of the problems is, because your obesity is not your identity. You have a completely separate identity, but you also happen to be obese. And it's sad because you see videos of people who have kind of bought into the whole fat acceptance movement and the body positivity stuff, and then they've ended up having like a ton of health problems because of the fact that they bought into it.
My body was good, and it was just unhealthy. And I didn't want to see that, and entering into the fat acceptance movement really made me blind to that. I think one of the pivotal points for me when the fat acceptance movement became not so great, in hindsight, in all, like, when I'm talking about all this throughout this entire time, I was not self-aware, and I didn't really become self-aware until I was about 21, about the state of my body and the state of my life if I kept on going on how I was going. But yeah, so one of like the big points that I remember was always subscribing to the idea that I was fat, but like I was healthy. My blood work was fine, like everything was fine, so I'm fine. That's one of the big things I always remember thinking, and that's one of the main things the fat acceptance community preaches, is the whole health at every size thing, which I do not. Having been both sides of the spectrum, I know that is not true. One of the other things I remember is, I remember thinking that my doctors were being unnecessarily harsh to me because of my weight, and that all of my health problems that I was having at the time were being blamed on my weight without actually looking into them. Looking back at some of the health problems I did have, they were weight related, and I just didn't want to face it. That's another thing that is preached a lot in the fat acceptance movement, is that your doctor's weighing you. I've actually seen this. Your doctor's weighing you at your appointment is fatphobic, which I think is the biggest crock of bull ever. If you're at a certain weight at a certain age, they have to start screening you for if you need a certain medication. And I know this because I was on that medication.
I think I understand the reason why we got to where we are today in regards to fat acceptance and all this kind of stuff. It's because prior to this, we had the heroin chic era where models and stuff were super skinny. This was the size 0 sample size time, and that led to a lot of problems because this became the ideal. So a lot of young girls were mimicking this and developing EDs. And so I think what we're seeing now is an overcorrection. So because this is what that led to, now we're overcorrecting, because when the pendulum swings, it rarely ever lands in the middle. It always goes to the opposite extreme. So now we've gone from glorifying unhealthily underweight bodies to glorifying unhealthily overweight bodies. And now people are uncomfortable to even say anything about it because they think that we're going to take ourselves back to the heroin chic era where, you know, people were unhealthily underweight, which is why you hear people say a lot of things like diet culture and all this kind of stuff, you know, like it's all kind of stemming from that past. But the thing is, we don't have to have two extremes. You know, we don't have to either have unhealthily underweight people or unhealthily overweight people. Like, the middle would be great if we could just glorify and celebrate people who are just normal sizes. Like, that's where we need people to be, because both versions are unhealthy and both lead to people dying prematurely. So if we can just get people back to the center again, where people are just a normal size, that would be great. Everything that I'm saying now could easily be taken as fatphobic, right? Because I'm not praising obesity and I'm not saying obesity is great and beautiful and whatever. So everything I'm saying could be taken as fatphobic. Some people would say that I'm a terrible person for doing that. And they think that they're the compassionate ones for saying that, you know, it's absolutely fine to be obese. You know, you should still be happy with yourself being obese. But I would argue that it's the opposite. I don't agree with bullying someone because of their weight or treating someone in like a disgusting manner just because of their size. Like, I don't agree with any of that. I think that you should treat everybody with basic human decency and respect regardless of what they look like or what size they are. That being said, I don't think there's anything remotely compassionate about lying to people and saying that they're healthy at any size. That is one of the least compassionate things you can do. And I'm tired of people claiming that they're compassionate whilst they do and say things that harm people. Another reason why I feel quite passionately about this as well is because obesity overwhelmingly affects Black women the most. Black women in the UK are the most overweight demographic, and I think the stats are very similar in America. And this is one of the causes of why we have higher rates of death during pregnancy and childbirth. The top things that kill us during pregnancy and childbirth is obesity and preeclampsia. So people can criticize me if they want all day and tell me that what I'm saying is fatphobic or whatever, but at the end of the day, obesity overwhelmingly affects women that look just like me. So, you know, for me to care about that, if that's such a terrible thing, then fine. God forbid I want more Black women to live, and God forbid I want less Black women to die during pregnancy and childbirth because of things that they can fix and change. Like, if that's such a terrible thing, then so be it. But I would say that to you, if you think you're compassionate by telling people who are very overweight that they're fine as they are, then I would really look up the definition of compassion, because I think that's nothing but cruel. But that's it for this video. It was a bit of a heavy one, but let me know what you think about this topic in the comment section. How do you think is the best way to handle this, you know, in terms of like what airlines can do, in terms of the policies that they put in place and stuff? I mean, American Airlines clearly had a policy on this which they didn't even follow. So, you know, I don't know. Does that mean Sydney has a right to sue technically? Because if they have a policy for safety reasons and they didn't follow their own policy, then technically they put her life in danger, so she could sue for that, no? I doubt she will anyway, but it's kind of interesting though how like people have policies but then they throw those policies out the window in order to get some social credit points on social media. If you enjoyed this video, then do like and subscribe. I really hope you're having a good weekend. I hope you're spending it with your family or spending it with your friends. Thank you very much for giving me your time today, and I will see you on Wednesday.